I'm Dan Gibson, and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology and Islam. In this video, we are going to look at the archaeological evidence for the prophets David and his son Solomon. Now, there are some archaeologists, commonly called minimalists, who claim that David and Solomon probably did not exist. For instance, the authors of the book, The Bible Unearthed, claim that at the time of the kingdoms of David and Solomon, Jerusalem was populated by only a few hundred residents or less, which is insignificant for an empire stretching from the Euphrates in the Syria all the way down to Eilat in the Red Sea. And many people are taken in by their arguments. Now, do you remember what we discussed back in video number 15? Abraham, the father of the nations, was a nomad. Several generations later, the family known as the children of Israel went to Egypt to escape a famine, and they lived there as nomads in the land of Goshen, tending cattle and sheep. They did this for several hundred years. It was only at the very end that they were forced into labor, but their wives and families still lived in tents with the animals. We know this because they came out of Egypt, they came with their animals and their tents. Later, we know that during the time of the Exodus, they were still nomads living in tents. And during the time that they slowly conquered the land of Canaan, after they took over Canaan, they were still nomads. They didn't mind burning and destroying the cities of Canaan because they lived in tents. Now, there's a story of Heber the Kenite and his tribe who separated themselves from Israel, and they moved their tents, indicating he was a tent-dwelling nomad. Some of the Canaanite tribes that they absorbed became hewers of wood and carriers of water. Notice that none of these captives became hewers of stone or haulers of stone. Do you know what it says in Judges 4 about Deborah, the ruler of Israel? She judged from under a tree, typical of a nomad. In Judges 4, there is a story of Sisera fleeing from his enemies, and he runs into the tent of Heber, and Heber's wife kills him with a tent peg. During the time of Gideon, the armies returned home from battle, and it says, to their tents. That's in Judges 7. There was constant strife between the Israelites in their tents and the city dwellers who are illustrated in the story of the Benjamite concubine. Here, it also mentions that Israel lived in tents, implying that the city is evil. During the time of Samuel, the people lived in tents. See 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 10. Now, some settlements seemed to come with the crowning of the king. King Saul was crowned first when he was appointed king, so he had to build up his army, and so there was some settlement of people. But remember, this was after 1,000 years of the children of Israel being nomads. We know that King David was a pastoralist in his youth. He was out in the fields looking after flocks of sheep and goats. Notice that there are many references to the cities of the Philistines. There are references to the cities of Canaan, but there are very few references to the cities of Israel outside of the cities of refuge, which were actually small towns with walls, not great cities. However, as the Israelites begin to settle, they slowly become more urbanized, and at the same time they slowly become more and more involved with the gods of the settled people. So from all of this, I believe that David's empire was mostly a nomadic empire. But some people argue nomads couldn't have led an entire empire so large. How could they administrate it? Well, I think of the Mongol Empire. It was much larger. It was administered by the mobile base where the leaders, the Khans, were located. And so wherever the Khan was, that's where the administration was. Also, if you consider the Sioux Nation in North America, which was also larger than that of David and Solomon's empire. So please do not make a big thing of this. They were too small, not enough buildings. The majority of the people lived in tents. There were some stone walled or just walled walls. In 2 Samuel 20, we read that Sheba, the son of Bichri, rebelled against King David and then escaped to the town of Abel of Beth-Machah. Listen to what it says about the town. And they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and they cast it out to Joab, who blew a trumpet, and they retired from the city, every man to his tent. And Joab returned to Jerusalem to King David. Now, what might a town like Beth-Machah have looked like? I have visited many ruins of towns from this period in Jordan. What is interesting is how the town is constructed. It's similar to some of the walled houses I saw in Yemen. In most cases, it had a central courtyard, and all the houses were built around the courtyard, and the outer walls of the houses were joined together to form the outer wall. So now, what confuses some people is that here in 2 Samuel they read that Abel of Beth-Machah was a city. The word here is used is Ayr, which can be translated as a city or a fortified height or even a mere encampment. The emphasis is on a guarded place, not on its size. But in the West, the word city, which is the word that the translators chose, implies a certain size. Here in Canada, we start with hamlets, then villages, then towns, and then cities. Unfortunately, the translators of the Bible chose to use the term city, which has falsely given us a sense of size. In actuality, it was probably a group of houses with their outer walls joined together in a circle. In this story, the army is outside the village, and here's what it says. They cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri. They cast it out to Joab. He blows the trumpet. They retire from the city, Eri, or the fortified height, and every man goes to his tent, and Joab returns to Jerusalem. Notice the term Eri is the fortified height, not a great city with walls, and it's a group of houses joined together. Also notice Joab, the leader of the army, goes back to Jerusalem to King David, and the rest of their people return where? To their tents. For far too long, people have gotten their ideas of history from artists who drew pictures. Those artists lived in the West. Often they didn't have any cultural background, and they drew pictures that would make sense to the settled people that they were drawing was their audience and people who would buy these pictures and so forth. Remember, King David had no city. In his whole kingdom, there was no city large enough for his capital city. So he took it from the Jebusites. That was a tribe that occupied a fortified area on the top of the mountain ridge. So David brought his fighting men, and they conquered the city. This story is in 1 Chronicles chapter 11. And the people in Israel were still living in tents. Imagine, David had to conquer a fortified area from another tribe in order to have a place where he could have a capital city. There's no place in all of Israel that he could find that was large enough. Everything we read about speaks to us of semi-settled nomads. Yes, a great empire, but semi-settled nomads. Even after David had a capital city, it says there he built for himself a house, and it's a notable event in the biblical record. But the temple of God, it says, is still in a tent. 1 Chronicles chapter 15. And so when people read books like the Bible Unearthed, they hear all the arguments about it being impossible that King David had a great city, and they all agree that, and then they think, oh, this proves that David and Solomon didn't exist. It's all because they too are expecting a great city, and they're expecting a great empire. They're not thinking like nomads, they're thinking like settled people. There is no great city with great monuments and great buildings. That doesn't exist. But this doesn't mean that there weren't rulers. It doesn't mean the empire didn't exist. Listen, there's a piece of pottery known as the Kayafa Ostracan, and it's in the Institute of Archeology in Tel Aviv. It contains a quote from Leviticus and also from 1 Samuel. This pottery is dated to 1010 BC, plus or minus 40 years. It has been carefully dated. And it's written in Old Hebrew. On the pottery it mentions the men and the tribal chiefs had established a king. Notice the date, 1000 BC, the very time that Saul and David became king. Notice the language, Old Hebrew. Well, it doesn't mention Saul or David or Solomon by name. It refers to a Hebrew king, exactly at the right time in history. This flies in the face of all the minimalists who want to tell us there was no king. And in fact, there was no empire. And maybe there wasn't even any Hebrew people at the time. Now, let's move on to the Dan Stella. This seems to be written by Hazael, who assassinated Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram and Damascus, and then he assassinated Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, of the house of David. But our minimalist friends will try and explain it away, claiming it cannot mean what it seems to say, since we know that David never really existed and there must be another explanation. Somebody else will say, oh, the Bible was written even after that time, so, it couldn't have happened. But there it is in stone, names of kings, names of people in Israel. Now, another piece of evidence comes from several archaeological digs that have taken place in Jerusalem. In 2005, Dr. Elad Mazar, who was digging in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount, came across the foundation of several large structures that date to the time of King David. This structure would have stood for many, many generations afterwards. Indeed, within the structure, she found a small clay seal, that's called a bulla, bearing an ancient Hebrew lettering with the name Yehuko, the son of Shemael, the son of Shovi. It's interesting because this seal is of an Israelite official, and he is mentioned twice in the Bible. This is pictured on the right. And then in 2008, she found a second bulla, only a few meters away from the first one, belonged to Gedaliah, the son of Pushar, who is mentioned as a high-ranking official in Jeremiah 38. That's the seal on the left. In 2010, excavators revealed a giant wall more than 220 feet long and almost 20 feet high. Dr. Mazar believes that this is the wall described in 1 Kings chapter 3, which says that Solomon built a wall around Jerusalem and connected the city of David with Solomon's temple. Inside the gate, Dr. Mazur and his team found large clay jars which were for holding grain, and the jar handles whose had seals on them inscribed, "To the King." Carbon dating at that site and of those pottery jars date to the 10th century BC when Solomon was king. Now, why can't we find a lot more evidence? Well, first of all, archaeological digs are slow and tedious. It takes a great deal of time. They go very carefully. Second, there are a limited number of archaeologists who can direct digs. Third, most of Jerusalem is covered with buildings and roads and other structures. Almost everything is covered over. And fourth, the city was destroyed several times, so anytime we do come and dig, what we find are the ruins of destruction and bits and pieces that are left afterwards. Another problem that archaeologists face is that recent researchers sometimes have made sensational announcements. A good example is an announcement made by Nelson Gluck, the American rabbi and archaeologist, when he announced that he had located Solomon's mines in Wadi Araba, in a place called Timnah. These mines, however, weren't filled with gold. They were extensive copper smelting plants. So Gluck countered that maybe this was the true source of Solomon's wealth. However, unable to connect the evidence to the biblical accounts, modern historians soon began to doubt Gluck's connection of Solomon to the to that region's copper production. So for the past few decades, conventional wisdom, along with the archaeologists and historians, they've held that Egypt built most of those mines during the 13th century BC. A theory that was supported by the discovery of an Egyptian temple at the complex back in 1969. So conventional wisdom among the scholars scoffed at the idea of Solomon's mines, with many scholars suggesting that they were just a figment of people's imaginations, and this was taught in universities everywhere and is still taught in some places today. David and Solomon probably didn't exist. No proof. Then in 2013, an archaeologist named Erez Ben Yusuf began a fresh set of excavations. And this time it was at a place known as the Slave Hill. This was down near those copper mines. It was a massive smelting camp containing the remains of hundreds of furnaces and layers of copper slag, the waste which was created by the smelting process. In addition to the furnaces, the researchers uncovered clothing, fabrics, ropes that were used there, made advanced ways in weaving. They discovered food like date and grapes and pistachios. There were lots of ceramics, plus different kinds of metal tools, as well as animal dung. So lots of stuff was sent over to England to the world-renowned Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit in Oxford University in England, and they dated 11 of those items to the 10th century BC, which according to the Bible is when Solomon ruled the United Kingdoms of Israel. The Slaves Hill dig demonstrates that the society in the Timna Valley was surprisingly complex. The smelting technology was relatively advanced, and the layout of the camp reflected a high level of social organization. Impressive cooperation would have been required for the thousands of people that were working at that place in the middle of the desert. What is not clear is who owned the mines and what sort of labor was used there when. It appears that there were Hebrews there were Egyptians there are also Edomites there were others involved over the years, but who was there when and how does it fit together? Archaeologists need to put more things together to get a clearer picture, but one thing is clear: the mines in Timna Valley were going strong during the time of David and later his son Solomon, when they were kings of United Israel. Now, David and Solomon are important. They're important in Islam, as they were both kings as well as people who received revelation or guidance. They both received what the Quran calls wisdom and knowledge from God. In the Quran, God made David a Khalifa, a title that the Quran otherwise gives only to Adam, Khalifa. David and Solomon's role as kings as well as messengers, a united role, is important in the Quran. It's important in the Quran as this parallels Muhammad's role as a ruler as well as a messenger. It is through David that we have the Psalms called the Zabur, the book in the Bible called the Book of Psalms. And it's among the largest book in the Bible. Solomon is also more than just a king. He is also a messenger of God, and he brings the books of wisdom, such as the book of Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes, and so forth. In many ways, David and Solomon also are important to the Jewish people, who know them as the kings during what they call the United Kingdom period. And that's when Israel looks back when they were a great nation. David and Solomon are also important to Christians. Christians especially look to David because God gave him a promise. You see, Christians are always interested in the ways that God revealed who the Messiah would be. The Messiah concept was given to Adam and Eve. Later it was narrowed down to the descendants of Abraham, as Abraham was chosen, and from him was a promise that out of his line would come the Messiah. So much of what God gave is similar to a promise to David. The Messiah would come through his line. So this keeps narrowing down the focus. Abraham and now down to David, so that when the Messiah came, he would be clearly identifiable. This is something that Christians are interested in, and it's something that appears in the Bible in the message of each of the prophets. Each prophet spoke out against sin and spoke out against evil. Each prophet called the people to follow God, and each of them in their own way added something to the information that would help future people be able to identify the coming Messiah. And so David and Solomon are important to people of faith, both Muslims, Jews, and Christians. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology